We're here in the new library of the Royal College of Physicians. It's the 18th of January 1996, and today we are interviewing Professor Michael Oliver, who was president of the college from 1986 until 1989. Where were you born?
Oh, that's one of the things I like to forget about. I was born in a tiny little place called Borth in Wales, and when my mother had finished having me, the family then left Wales. We've never returned. I don't regard myself as a Welshman.
No, but you could play for Wales if you wanted to.
Well, my father had ideas that he was going to make a successful sheep farm, which he did manage to do. And so when it was unsuccessful, then we left Wales.
Right, and where did you move to?
Oh, into Hampshire, which is where I was effectively brought up. Right. And I was there until 18.
And where did you go to school?
Marlborough in Wiltshire, in Wiltshire. Used to bicycle there across during the war when we had no cars and petrol rationing. 40 miles of good cardiovascular exercise as a teenager.
So you weren't a boarder there, you were a day boy?
No, I boarded there. No, there were no day boys, but no, it was just 6 times a year going backwards and forwards.
Right. What was it like at Marlborough?
Well, I had been to a boarding school before, and if I hadn't been, I think I would have found it very difficult. It was fairly tough, fairly rigid, and one learnt a great deal about self-discipline. I went there in 1939, and just after the war had begun. And
you were just a tot then, were you?
Well?
You were just a tot?
Yes. And left in 43. And so they had 4 years there, about 4 years. And we were all under a fair amount of pressure in the sense that there was, when I first went there, the war hadn't really started, although it had been declared, but there was no war until about another year later. It was a phony war. But in 1940, everything hotted up in a big way. And in the south of England, there was a good deal of concern for a year or so, and during those war years, all of us, and I was, well, I must have been 15, 16, and we were very committed to learning and to responsibility. It was rather strange looking back on it, and I didn't realize it at that time, but if you compare maybe the attitude of some of my children and other friends' children, we were very much concerned that we should fulfill our obligations to the nation. It sounds rather a grandiose thing to say, but that's the way it was.
And it was a concertina childhood, was it?
It was what?
A concertina. Everything was compressed.
Yes, in a sense it was. We worked very hard. I mean, there was very little relaxation, and we weren't allowed to go out on the playing fields from time to time because of the risk of being machine gunned, and whether the German came across quite a bit, and gasworks were blown up and things like this, and so that the beak said, well, you know, that's out of bounds during the summer months, and during the Battle of Britain there was no question of really going out and about. And we had our air raid shelters and disappeared down whenever there was a siren went, which was fairly frequent. But we did work hard, and then in 1941 maybe, I suppose it was, a school from London, the City of London school, was evacuated to Marlborough, and so we had a double classes of everything. And the fact that they were evacuated and they were committed people, I don't know, we worked hard. I studied history. I didn't do any biology at all, and I was quite intrigued in that, and I got rather involved in classics as well.
Are you still a classicist? Do you
I wouldn't describe myself a classicist. I mean, I took my Latin and Greek up to the age of 17, but I wouldn't regard myself as a classicist, most of which I've forgotten.
Right. And what's the sport during this time? I mean, did they, or was it abandoned in Marlborough?
No. We used to play cricket and football and hockey. I mean, one of the embarrassing things was my father was there. He was the captain of the school and a great cricketer. He was also captain of the MCC in his time. And when I first went, very first day, I suppose, to the school, I went down to the sports outfitter to get my cricket bat and pads and so on. And I said M.F. Oliver, and the man behind the counter said, W.F.L. Oliver's son? I said yes. So he said, I'm going to come and watch you in the nets. So he came up the weekend afterwards, and I was duly bowled at, you see, and with my bat and so shook his head and said, no, not W.F.L. Oliver's son. So that was a rather defeating situation.
Because your father was a very distinguished cricketer, wasn't he?
Yes, he was he was a good sportsman. He was a left-hander. He was also amateur golf champion in 1922, and he was a strange and difficult man.
Yes, but he captained Derbyshire, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he captained Kent before,
right. And
then he went to Derbyshire. I don't quite know why he went, because we lived in Kent, but still, he did do that for a short time.
Yes.
Then he went back to the army after that.
He was an army man, was he?
He was quite an interesting man. He was our very, very young commandant in Odessa after the war, with the express commission of bringing out as many White Russians as was possible, and drove an engine with his adjutant up to Ekaterinburg, because there was some question that the Tsar's family was there, but of course he couldn't find a way and he was blocked by the boss. So quite interesting diaries he's got about all this.
Oh, how interesting, because my father was in the Merchant Navy going out to collect White Russians. And
he would have interesting stories.
Yes, yes.
This was after the war. Yes. I mean, yes. He was, my father was, I think in 1918, he was a young major, and he was jacked up and made, and then came back again to a brevet colonel to run the mission of getting out the White Russians, which he did very successfully, except he didn't find the Tsar.
No.
And
had to wait until recently for that, didn't they?
Well, in one of his diaries, he said, well, I know this isn't going to be a successful mission, but one of the great enjoyments is that I and whatever his man's name was, George, have the engine and the tender to drive. That's all they had, an engine and a tender. I don't quite know what they were going to do if they had found it. There was no passenger, no coach behind it. But he also recorded, because he got stuck up in South Russia, he also recorded the number of quail that he shot every day. And these were in the level of 1,700 or 1,800 quail. It's a strange world.
Yes. Were you drawn more to studies of history and classics than you were to sport at that period?
Yes, I was. I was very much involved in the thing that interested me most was the Reformation and maybe 16th, 17th century history. And I got an exhibition to Oriel College for that, but because I wasn't allowed to take it up because the war was on.
Right.
Thereby hangs a rather curious story, because after I qualified in medicine here in Edinburgh in 1947, I got a letter from the bursar of Oriel, which was a very short letter. Dear Oliver, we need to keep our records right and wish to know when you intend to take up your exhibition. Yours sincerely. And I wrote back, Dear bursar, I have qualified in medicine about 4 months ago, and I don't think you need to include me in your records. So he wrote back, Dear Oliver, this is the totally illogical letter that I have received from you. Are you or are you not going to take up your exhibition? The fact that you qualified in medicine has nothing whatever to do with it.
So did you do your A-levels in, or whatever the equivalent?
Yes, the equivalent of, yes, the equivalent
in
of.
classics?
No, in history.
History.
In
and
history.
then what made you decide to, what happened next?
Well, it's actually quite difficult, Martin, to remember quite what the various different influences were.
Was there any medicine in your family?
Well, my father had died. No, nobody has been a doctor ever. My father had died by then, and he was a very dominant man. And he was killed in the war, 1940. I suppose 41. And so, and I was the only child, so that in a sense I was independent of him because he was a dominant man, and I respected him and very much. But I was quite relieved in a sense that as a teenager, flexing my muscles as one would, you have some independence. And so he had, and his father and before them and so on, had always been involved in, seems a funny thing to say, serving the country.
Yes.
And this was the fact that his only son was even possibly thinking at wartime that there were other things to do was anathema to him. And when he became more and more dictatorial, and I became more and more reactive, and I had one or two friends at school who were, one particular friend who was became a conscientious objector and a member of the Friends Ambulance Unit. And I was moderately pacifist, not so much as this man, whose name was Vickers, and his father was a general, and the reason why he was reactive you can imagine. And yes. And I had another very good friend who was a poet, and we were a sort of small intellectual group of people, I suppose. And I decided, I mean, I'm not quite sure whether I can answer your question accurately because I don't really quite know what the influence was, but I decided that I didn't want to be competent, although later it seemed to be a curious decision. But I decided I didn't want to be competent, and I was 17 and a half, and there were certain preserved occupations, one of which was medicine, other of which was doing things in agriculture, economy, and so on. We didn't need to go into the services. And I took a decision which I suppose was probably related to being reactive to my family, not to become a competent. And so I then did 2 terms, the last 2 terms of school, I switched over to begin to cut up frogs and did minimal biology, which was frowned upon very much by the history section and by the classics section. What are you doing going off there? And you never get your pass to Oxbridge. Well, I did get the pass to Oxbridge, which, as I told you, I didn't take up. So then I thought, well, all right, then I became quite interested in, surprisingly, I got rather involved in biology at those short terms. And then I did an odd thing, because I had there's a sort of minimal amount of inorganic chemistry, which we all had to do anyway, minimal. But I became interested in chemistry, and then began to do a certain amount of reading on my own of organic chemistry, which was hardly taught at all at the school. It was in the chemistry 6th, which I wasn't in. I was in the history 6th on the other side. But I went across from, I had a friend there, and we spent quite a lot of time in the evenings, and I became more and more interested in this, and I thought, well, the whole thing sort of moved itself towards the thought of going into medicine. And then my mother had remarried again, and married the local general practitioner, who was a very dear man and a wonderful stepfather. And he hadn't been married before, and I don't know how he managed to cope with this 17-year-old brat, which I've no doubt I was, like all 17-year-olds. And so he influenced me. It was the first contact I really had with medicine. And these various different forces decided me that I would have a go at medicine. And
what were the teachers like at Marlborough? Were they, because they must have been those who were not available for military service, or were they good teachers?
Yes, very. I don't think that looking back on it, the science teachers were particularly good. It was a church school. It was a school that was founded in, I forget, 1840 or something, for the sons of parsons, which we didn't have in the family. Well, I suppose, but some time back, but not at that time. And it was really quite a non-secular school, and we had a very rigid structure, and the scriptures were quite important. And I suppose that's how the classics came into it.
Yes.
Because there were certain occasions where we had to have a chapel every morning at 8:45, and we had all to be on parade. Well, I was rather a bit of did things which didn't please everybody, because I was a horse rider, and there were, at that time, I don't know, does this interest you?
Yes, it's fascinating. Yes, of course it does.
Well, I don't know. I used to, being an only child, I suppose, I used to do things on my own a great deal, and I had a pony, and then bit by bit it got more and more, and I got more involved, and used to ride sort of in gymkhanas and point-to-points and things like that, and got intrigued because there was a man called Lawson who was the trainer at the back up in Manton Manton Racing School, racing stables, and Lord Derby, who had gone to the war, I suppose, had a string of 32 horses, and the jockeys and the stable boys had all gone off to the war.
Right.
So I, with a friend called David Weatherall, it's not the same David Weatherall in Oxford, I mean, of course, we used to go off at 6 in the morning on our bikes and going up the hill in order to exercise these fantastic steeds. They were wonderful. You didn't dare touch the reins. You did it all with your knees, otherwise you'd be off, because they were so sensitive. Right. So I used to come down each day. I mention this because the beacon parade in chapel said, a bit of a smell of horses round here. So,
yes.
Well, it was a good discipline and good education, I must say. So that's how I got into medicine.
And you did medicine in Edinburgh?
Yes, it was 400 and 500 miles from where I lived.
What made you decide?
Well, it was my stepfather was a Glasgow graduate, and he was able, I think, in some way, to put his finger on the medical pulse at that particular time, 1942-3.
Yes.
I say 2-3 because I did a 4.5-year course in medicine. That was concertina in those days. I didn't need to do the whole 5 years. And he recommended, without any persuasion to go into medicine, recommended me to go to Edinburgh, which had a particularly good reputation at that time in his book. Although it would have been easier perhaps to have gone to one of the London medical schools, but that's what I did, and of course I've never looked back.
So you arrived in Edinburgh. Had you been to Edinburgh before?
No, I'd never been to Scotland.
This is what happened to me, similarly.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Newly died father, and arrived in Scotland, yes. And did you stay in digs?
Did I?
Stay in digs, or did you stay in one of the halls?
I stayed in Ramsay Lodge.
Did you?
Ramsay Lodge was one of the halls of residence of the university at that time. Blackie House, Ramsay Lodge, and there was another one.
At the top of the mound?
That's right. And I lived there for 3 years in a bay window, looked right out over the Forth. There were a group of, I suppose, 40 of us there.
Were they mixed?
Not all, completely mixed.
Right.
All males,
yes.
But there weren't very many medicals. Maybe 10 of us or 8 of us were medicals.
Did you do botany, chemistry?
Yes.
Now, did you have to walk down to botany on Saturday morning?
Yes. I either walked or took a tram.
Yes.
There was a tram at the bottom of the mound, so I went down there and took a tram down with old Willie Wright Smith, who was the professor of botany.
What was he like?
And well, Willie Wright Smith must have been 6'4", and he possibly weighed about 8 stone, and he was a gangly creature, who was very, well, he was very committed to his subject, and he was the Regis keeper, and he was obviously a distinguished man in his own way, and he was really not very interested in any of us unless we understood what the xylem was and why there was a xylem. And it had to, then he got all excited when he started to dissect and cut up the plants. But botany was, I think it was a whole year of botany.
Yes. Did you used to go swimming on a Saturday morning? One of the people used to down to the Forth.
Yeah, you did that too, did you?
No, but we knew people who did.
Yes, I did. That's right.
It is said that he used to lecture from behind a sort of bush of flowers. Is that, or was that?
Well, he hid his talents in a bushel, put it that way.
Yes.
Well, we had some rather interesting people. You see, he's got some similarity to old R.W. John Stone, who was the professor of obstetrics and gynecology. Well, that was about 4 years later I ran across him. And he had lorgnettes with a black sash hanging down, and he wore a frock coat. 1944.
Yes.
A frock coat with lorgnettes. And so he arrived with a great scenario. And Willie Ryan Smith also was very formally dressed. He used to wear one of these high Edwardian round collars, stiff white collars, on a Saturday, and his great tall height, and he was quite a dominant figure, but an attractive man. Yes, he took us out for walks in the botanical gardens, which were moderately exhausting because he was at great strides forward, and a few of us were trying to catch up with him, and he was talking in Latin all the way, you see, about all the plants. And we were supposed to follow this and note them all down.
Did you make the transition from history to science quite easily, and was botany a nice transition?
Yes, because I had got this little interest in chemistry, and then I became really quite involved with it, and spent a lot of time in physiology and biochemistry.
Now, who taught you chemistry?
Who taught me chemistry? Well, no, there he was. It was Marion later.
That was biochemistry, wasn't
Guy
it?
Marion.
Yes.
Oh, chemistry was...
Ritchie?
Who?
Ritchie?
No.
And then there was zoology and...
No, he was zoology, Ritchie.
Yes,
No.
yes.
I remember before the end of this, it was a man wore a black bow tie. It was a Fellow of the Royal Society of London.
Berger?
And what?
Berger?
Yes.
The iodine and pyroxene.
Yes.
Then.
Well, then I did chemistry, biochemistry, and physiology, and then we had a combined.
Now, who taught you those?
Huh?
There was Guy Marion.
Guy Marion.
Now, what was he like?
Oh, Guy Marion was a great charmer, but irascible, and would be. Well, he was at that stage. He was just beginning to discover the original estrogenic hormones. He described estriol, estrone, and estradiol when I was a student, for which he was made an FRS, and he was appointed professor of biochemistry probably at the age of 32 or 33. He was there for a long time, and he was deeply involved in his innovative work, which was distinguished work. And the man who did most of the lecturing was Stedman.
Right.
And some of us were not, I don't think I actually did this, but I certainly was there at the time when it was done several times, when some wag would, at the back of the lecture theatre, would take out a penny and get the penny exactly primed so it would bounce down each of the steps right to the bottom. And ting, 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 everybody stopped and listened. And poor Stedman, who was a nice man, I feel very sorry for him now, and after the fourth or fifth day running, when this penny was dropped down, he, of course, stopped and what is this? And so this wag at the back said, well, that's what we think your lectures are worth.
Oh dear.
And the poor man went out in tears.
Oh, what a shame.
Can you imagine? And the class then, of course, was mortified, and the wag at the back got it in the neck. So weren't very kind to some of our teachers. But there was a combined course there, which you see intrigued me. I don't know quite how long back it was, but it was not like an Oxbridge course, but it was rather similar because we stopped after 6 terms, and I was lucky enough to get the first pass of that combined chemistry, biochemistry, physiology course, and de Burgh Daly was the professor of physiology.
Right. Goodness me!
And he.
What was he like?
Rather almost incomprehensible. he and I got on quite well because I had become interested in the chemistry of membranes, and he, of course, was a neurophysiologist, a great distinction. And to find a student who would trouble himself to think about how things cross through membranes into cells was interesting. And I remember him taking me to his home on 2 or 3 occasions, and then completely bamboozling me because I was only a student. I mean, he was talking at high level biochemistry to me and neurophysiology, but he was somewhat obscure. He wasn't really.
And did he do the bulk of the teaching in that course, or was it delegated?
No, it was not a. It was a sort of subsidiary. Well, it was part of the medical curriculum, and they had at the end of the first 2 years something which I suppose nowadays would be called a BSc type degree, and we all had to do that. But then there was a group of us, or maybe 12 or 14 of us, who were put into the so-called honours section of that course, and which I found very stimulating, and that has never lost my interest in biochemistry because of that early activity.
Was George about at that time?
George, well, if he was, I didn't know him. I met George in a different way. Yeah. That was because he and I were both in 1950, jumping some years now. Yeah. He and I were both pursuing, starting research into atherosclerosis.
Well, we can talk about George.
Okay, well, I'll tell you how I met him later. Okay.
But, and then anatomy.
Anatomy was Brash.
Brash.
Yes. And who was as dry as he could be. And, of course, we had to go through 6 bloody terms of anatomy. God, unbelievable. And every single origin of every single muscle and I mean, the details. I was throwing out a whole lot of books the other day, and the fine details, the drawings. I don't think the students nowadays have to do that, and quite right too.
You haven't thrown them, have you? Are they in the bucket?
Yes. Oh, I mean, well, they're all there in E.B. Jimison's book.
Yes.
You see, Jimmy was in Ramsay Lodge.
Yes. So you had a double dose of him.
I had a double dose of it, yes. And he used to wear his black skull cap and the filthy pipe we used to smoke every evening through dinner in Ramsay Lodge. And he was a remarkable man, lovely blue, clear eyes, and a lot of interesting general comments. There was a philosopher in a philosophy student who. A man called Mankell, I don't know what's happened to him at all, and he and old Jimmy used to set up sort of informal debating discussions every Sunday evening, and so that we would put forward what we want to talk about on a Friday, what subject this house considered should be discussed. And it wasn't very formal at all, but they were very good foil to medicine, because again, still the war was on in 1943, 4-5. I'm talking about those years. We were very serious. There was no. We recognised. I think every one of us recognised, not just medicine, but all the students, because there were foresters there. Why Mankell from philosophy would be allowed to study philosophy during the war, I don't know. But they were all. Most of them were subjects that were important to the economy of the country or the defence of the country. And we all recognized that we were extremely privileged because we decided, for one reason or another, not to be combatants, not to serve king and country, but to do it another way around. And so that we were very committed, we were hard-working people. And
what was Jimmy like? You would know him in the anatomy dissecting theatre.
Oh yes, forever. I can smell it still.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was he like there? He had his hole in the corner, didn't he? Through the glass door, or his den at the far end of anatomy.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I thought, you see, one just did it. You got on with it. That's 6 terms. 6 after. I think it was every afternoon a week.
Yes.
5 afternoons a week.
And how often would he come and sit at your body? Was he?
Oh, quite often. Quite frequently. And I mean, my body, you see, was beginning to decay after a while. It got a bit stale.
Yes.
And so extraordinary looking back in it all. And I mean, it was dissecting the leg, and all the muscles were getting drier and harder, and it was working through to find out exactly where the femoral nerve went to, and so on.
And the disconcerting things in his book, there were blue, green, and yellow.
There
were never blue, green, and yellow in the body, were they?
Oh no. No, it wasn't dyed in that way. No. We are right.
Well, what were the spots like?
What was what like?
The spots from Jimmy, when he had the spot examinations.
I'd forgotten about it. Yes. Well, yes. I had completely forgotten about it. It was like drawing something out of a hat. The spots were they were fairly small, and they weren't very easy to identify. I suppose I didn't do very well. I wasn't that interested in anatomy. It was all too static and dead. And the little sort of the subject, the course that I've described, which was a physiology biochemistry course, did not include anatomy in its so-called tripos. It was like a small tripos. And I absconded fairly frequently from the anatomy room and went off to across through the back door to Edinburgh Daily, and fiddled around there with membranes and so on.
Jimmy was an attractive figure, though, in the halls. He was a sort of leader and
Oh yes. Well, he was an eccentric.
Yes.
And a real eccentric, and one knew that he had immense knowledge, and he was also. Well, he was wise, and we weren't wise. We were children, and you recognise wisdom and experience.
You never went to Shetland?
No. No, I never went to Shetland. I was, I think, possibly asked. We had a man called McLaughlin, Toothy McLaughlin, who was had been a medical student for 18 years. Who was still in Ramsay Lodge in his 4th year. And he was allowed to be there. I don't know how he was allowed to. I think he had a certain amount of cash, otherwise he couldn't have gone on. And he and Jimmy became great friends. And Toothy McLaughlin must have been 46 or 7 when he qualified. And after all these years.
An anticlimax.
Yeah, yes, it was, because he then went off to his island somewhere in Old Man of Hoy or somewhere like that, and he practiced there and died very soon afterwards.
What a shame.
He was a perennial medical student. And there were several people. There was a forestry student. Well, he wasn't a student. I mean, he again, he was 40. He'd been there for a long, long time. Yes. And he didn't have his BSc, but he taught in the forestry department. And it was an interesting group to be with, as a young boy of 19 or something, 20, to meet these people.
And then you moved across Middle Meadow Walk into the Royal Infirmary.
Yes, I was still in Ramsay Lodge and then.
Yes. And who taught you there? Who were your clinical teachers?
Oh, well, that was Ray Gilchrist, because we had, which I think is a pity, it's gone now, there was an opportunity in the last term of the first 2 years, the 6th term, when we went as pre-clinical students down the driveway in Middle Meadow Walk, down the driveway in the Royal Infirmary, to have our first introduction to clinical medicine. And each of the chiefs, and the sub-chiefs so-called, would give a lecture. And this was twice a week. So that got through in the summer term, all of them. And we were then invited to put our names down for a particular clinic to start in the beginning of the next year.
Right.
And I was attracted by the way Gilchrist presented his subjects. He, for example, I can remember, my subject today is red, white and blue. Now, you don't know what that means.
Not a clue.
No. Polycythemia, anemia and cyanosis, you see. But yes. he caught the students' imagination, red, yes. white and blue. Right. And he was very logical, and I liked his logic. He was fairly formidable, and remained that way. Derek Dunlop, whom you knew well, I thought was much more, but he's much more laid back. And Stanley Davison, the other possibility, I really couldn't understand a lot of what Stanley Davison was trying to teach, because he obviously had a very high intellect, but it was disorganized, and he wasn't a good teacher. I didn't think he was. He didn't stay with one subject. But Derek Dunlop, of course, attracted me very much, and it might be relevant to this discussion to tell you the first time I ever met him, which was at one of these lectures, which they were offering themselves, as it were, to the students for choice. And this very elegant Basil Rathbone type figure came striding in with his black hair, wonderful blue suit, immaculate to a degree, in 1944, when we had clothes rationing on fire. Anyway, that's how he appeared. And I didn't actually quite realize what it was. There was something uneasy about it when he came in. And then after about 20 seconds or so, I realized it's a very strange way of lecturing, because he came in and he walked across the blackboard and then reversed and then walked back to the blackboard, the far side, blackboard being here, and then reversed. Now, of course, many people walk as they talk, but they turn round. But he wasn't turning around, he reversed. And it took me quite a while to, very strange, you see. I mean, actually walking backwards. And the subject was gastric lavage. And of course, what he had was a nasal tube in the left side, left nostril, a gastric tube in situ when he came in. And of course, none of us knew this, because that's why he was facing this way, so his wonderful profile, you couldn't see the tube coming up. And then he turned round, you see, and of course we were all electrified by this, and it was a very good teaching lesson to make you realize when you have a nasal tube in, actually you can lecture perfectly well. That was sort of melodrama that he produced. And many stories. I mean,
was Tarara Todd?
What?
Was Tarara Todd?
Yeah, he was there, yeah.
Yes.
Tarara Todd.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, he was a bad lecturer, but he was, well, they were all there. I mean, he was there, and old David Marilan, who was completely confusing and confused,
yes.
And to our Todd, J.D.S. Cameron, J.D.S. Cameron was the sub-chief, W.D.D. Small,
right.
was there, who was dry as he could be,
yes.
And Fergus Hewitt.
Right. And who were you taught by with the surgeons? Who were the surgeons who taught you?
Well, it was Learmonth.
Right.
Mostly, I was in Learmonth's clinic.
And how did you enjoy him?
Gilchrist and Learmonth, and then later, I suppose I must have been in Walter Mercer's clinic, because I became Walter Mercer's house surgeon.
Because he was a wonderful man, wasn't he?
Yes.
And it always struck me as, well, this is real prejudice, it always struck me as curious that he became an orthopaedic surgeon. He struck me as having... Well,
you see, it struck me as being pretty odd, because I say I became Gilchrist's house physician, and then the 1 year of post qualification, pre-registration year, I became first Gilchrist's house physician and then Mercer's house surgeon. And the sort of situation which I remember very well, we had a farm labourer came in who quite probably, looking back on it now, we didn't know it in those days, must have taken some aspirin. And he was known to have a gastric ulcer. And he bled and bled and bled. And we gave him 27 pints, which to me was the first time I'd ever been thought in double figures. And it went on, and the more we put it in, the more it came out. It had bled and bled and bled and bled. And this was 3 a.m, I suppose, something like that. So I rang Walter Mercer, because in those days the house surgeon or the house physician was in contact. It's interesting to see what had happened since. Direct contact with the chief. There was no difficulty as the house surgeon. You rang up the chief. You didn't bother with anybody else between. And the chief came in. So Walter Mercer came in and he did a gastrectomy within about 20 minutes or 20 to 25 minutes. And when scrubbing up at the end, he said, well, that's my 11th today. And he'd done 11 gastrectomies. Yes. And this because then he became professor of orthopedic surgery, which is a bit anomalous.
Very odd that, wasn't it? Because was he not the first man to tie a patent ductus?
Yes, yes, he was, and I was his assistant at the first blue baby operation in the UK. Brock in London did this a little bit later, but Gilchrist, who became quite close to Walter Mercer, provided the ductuses about 1944, and then moved on to cyanotic heart disease. And the first Blaylock operation, making the shunt, was done by a little girl called Maureen Gilmore, who was in 1948, who I had looked after in Gilchrist ward, and then we operated on. So that was the first blue baby operation, 1948, in the UK, done by an orthopedic surgeon.
But what was Learmonth like? I mean, there are many stories about him, aren't there? I mean, Fat Jim or whatever. Was he a nice man to work for as a houseman, or was he...
Gilmore?
No, Learmonth.
Oh, Learmonth. Martinet. Meticulous to a degree. I mean, he was Walter Mercer, you see, operated with the highest possible speed and minimal trauma. Now, Jim Jeffrey, who was his assistant, operated with the lowest possible speed and maximum trauma. And Learmonth was always... Learmonth, in a sense, was the first precision, so far as I was concerned, the first precision surgeon. If there had been binocular aids, which there weren't in those days, you can imagine him always anastomosing arteries to each other. He was very, very precise. He was a bit of he was a fusspot. Yes. And he was intolerant too. We tried to take the mickey out of him from time to time, and he wouldn't. He was a very good teacher, I might say, but I remember he always wore gloves when he was using the blackboard. And this upset some of the students. I mean, why can't he use chalk? But he said this would upset his surgical hands, you see. So, needless to say, somebody took the mickey out of him and filled his gloves with soot on one occasion. So the Regent Professor of Surgery was not pleased with that, and we were dismissed for a week. We were told in no way. They just out, the whole lot of it.
People are immensely brave in the light of people like that, aren't they?
Yeah, yes. But and there was no regret. We were just, and we were also told that we wouldn't get our whatever the thing was.
DP.
Yes, but we wouldn't get the whole lot of us. So it doesn't matter who's involved, but you're not going to get your certificate and DP.
Yes. DP. And then you were taught by R.W. John Stone, were you?
Yes. Yeah.
And what was he like?
What was he? Well, he'd written a textbook at that stage John Stone's textbook of obstetrics and gynecology, and he more or less bored the pants off us because he went through the textbook all the time. He didn't bore the pants off us as much as Stanley Davidson did, because he was writing his textbook. Then what we had from Stanley all the time as students was his lecture notes, which he hadn't yet made it into this.
Right.
And he would come in, and we'd be given the sheet of paper on arrival, a foolscap and maybe 6 sheets, and you just read through this and go on and on and on reading through, turn over the next one, no teaching at all. Didn't use it, there were no slides in those days used anyway, there were no blackboard was used. He just went on doing this, and it was boring as hell. Well, we of course didn't go to his lecture. I wasn't going to be bothered with this. After the first half a dozen times I realized that I could read these perfectly happily at home without listening to him reading his own notes, because we already had them. So I skipped that lot. I don't think I got very good points for doing so, but...
But all the time you were attracted to Ray Gilchrist as your teacher. Now, what was it, when you began to get to know him, what was it that you found attractive about him? Because here were three very marvellous men, weren't they? Possibly one of the best periods in this century.
All three.
Of Edinburgh medicine.
Well, you see, there were prima donnas then. You can't... Gilchrist was extremely tough. He didn't suffer fools at all. And he was rude. I mean, I can remember one student when I was a houseman with him, and he was a rigid teacher, and there was a poor old lady with rheumatoid arthritis, all gnarled up, and so the student was asked to come and comment about these hands, Miss So-and-so, you see. So Miss So-and-so picked the hands up, which were fairly painful, I think, and said, "A little stiff, sir, and so are you," you see. and this is the way it went. And so then on another occasion, "He looks a bit pale, sir." A bit pale? Is it a bit raining, or isn't it raining outside? It's raining or it's not raining. Is he pale? He's not pale. Come on. We were. Oh yes, he was quite a tough teacher. It was very hard work because we used to admit, when I was a houseman there, every Wednesday we admitted up to about 17 in the take night. The great relief was down at 8, but 8 to 17 was about the range. And every single case history had to be completely written by 9 o'clock. So when the chief came in, he would have it in front of him. It had been written clearly so that he could read this through. And you had the full case history, the past history, the family history, the examination findings done by the houseman. Nobody else was allowed to do it. Well, nobody else was there, actually, come to think of it. The registrars sailed in later. They weren't registrars in those days. They were class 1s and class 3s out of the army, out of the services. So the houseman had to do all this. And then one thing we were not allowed to do was to give a diagnosis until he had read it all through. And what's your diagnosis, Oliver? You see? So you had to give your diagnosis in front of the assembled group, and then you had to defend yourself. and he would invariably, I don't think he ever once said that I was right. And I was occasionally, not very often maybe. You weren't allowed to get away with that. Well, what's the alternative? What are the possibilities? Have you thought this through? And how do you know it isn't that? And what have you done to set up investigations to show that you're right? And well, the patient had only appeared about 4 hours before. The patient
had sleep before either.
Well, about 5 in the morning, you see.
Yes.
So it was never any question of going to sleep, of course.
And did you have to do hematology on them through the night as well?
Yes.
Yes. That was a real bite.
Yes, oh, absolutely. You had to have the hemoglobin and the ESR all done, and you couldn't get away with the fact, BSRs we called them then. You couldn't get away with the fact that when he asked for it, well, it's still running through, sir. The hour isn't up yet. Well, why isn't it up? You see, when did you put it up? You see, why weren't you more organised? So it was high pressure stuff, but it was very good.
Were the sisters supportive of you? Were the sisters?
Yes, sister. Well, Katie Ballantyne. Yes, but if you trod out of line, a millimetre out of line, the white hat would go up, and you'd get hell from her, and really get hell from her, and she'd go purple in the face, and she was. I'm not sure she wasn't more of a boss than Gilchrist actually.
Yes.
Gilchrist used to come for 4 hours, do his ward round. It took 4 hours to do a ward round, and he'd come back the next day. But every day do around 4 hours. This was the chief, and you then take him out to his car, which is an immense Rolls Royce, and he would sail off down to his consulting rooms, I suppose. But there was always a final comment. So in the winter, when it was snowing, you would be kept outside the car, and the 4th bed on your left, I think you should do so-and-so, and the snow was coming down, it was raining down. But he didn't ever chase his tail, so he never would telephone, or he wouldn't come back on a routine day. He'd come back on waiting day in the evening. So you had him then as well. The consultants in those days were much, much more involved.
Yes.
Well, I don't know about now, because I'm out of it, but when I was a young consultant, we had much, much bigger staff, and we were less involved than during my training years.
Yes. Was he innovative?
Innovative. I don't think he was, no. I think he was just a very fine teacher and a very fine diagnostician. Innovative, no, not in a research sense, but he was stimulating.
Yes.
And he would ask questions in such a way that you would want to try it yourself to find out the answers. He wouldn't do it himself.
No.
I think that they think it probably applied to Derek and to Stanley Davis, and I think that they worked very hard every morning. Stanley, no doubt, went to his university department in the afternoon. Gilchrist went to his consulting rooms, and that was their day. There was no... In Gilchrist's case, he was, I suppose, the least academic of the three. But they were all prima donnas, and they could get away with abuse and behaviour that would never be permitted nowadays. But they were all liked, interestingly.
Yes, yes. I mean, he never struck me as a man who was consumed with doubts.
No.
And yet...
no, that's true.
Implicit in what you're saying is that he raised thoughts in people who worked with his mind that then set off the next stage of cardiology.
He produced a lot of loyalty. I don't think anybody who I knew, John Tulloch, Donald Gibbs, Bobby Marquis, all sorts of people, we were all immensely loyal. We all got knocked on the head and abused in one way or another. He was an intransigent man, a difficult man.
Yes.
But President of the College at one time.
Yes.
But it was good training.
Yes. Should we start with that tea now?
As you like.
Yes.
As you like.
Yes. You ready? So, after you'd done your house jobs, what did you do?
Well, I went to general practice in Leith.
Leith?
For 2 years.
Right.
Well, again, there was the option that you either went into services or you could go into a reserved occupation. And I decided I'd go into general practice. And I worked as an assistant with Dr. Angus Walker in Wellington Place in Leith, where it was a pretty rough practice, I can tell you. We were right in the docks in the days when all the buildings which you see nowadays are all new buildings there. And the slums were unbelievable. And you went up in a house in the Kirkgate, which I recall very well. There were 5 levels on either side of the stair head, and in each of the 5 were 5 rooms, and each of those rooms had a family. And there were several hundreds living there. And they were all using the stair head loo too. And on the 3rd one on the way up, for example, they never had a door there. And it was always the same man wearing his cap sitting on the throne. You'd be going to see Maggie. You see, Maggie being on the top. And I said, well, mind your own business. He said, she thinks she's pregnant, but she couldn't be. You see, got all this. And it was interesting days because Dr. Walker was a very, very good doctor. And I was in practice at the time the health service began. And so that overnight, we had our surgery was from 6 to 7 in the evening. And the next day, it was 6 to 9:30, with queues all the way down in the links for their specs or their teeth or whatever it was. Yes. And this went on for months. And it was a lot of work and writing out little pads of getting new hearing aids and so on. It was interesting days. I wouldn't have missed that at all. But then I decided I wanted to get back to my biochemistry, and I did my 2 years, and that was that.
And of course that makes one a good clinician, isn't it, those years in general practice?
Well, it was a tremendously important learning exercise, not only from the medical diagnostic point of view, but from the point of view of meeting people. I mean, it was the first time I really ever, outside the house job, when you're in an artificial situation in a ward, and the senior consultant saw the outpatients, and the young doctor didn't see the outpatients, but to have to be on your own, and again it was hard work, but there's nobody is harmed by hard work because there's a lot of night work, but to get to know certain families, these families, for example, I describe in the Kirkgate, who were pretty, not necessarily poor, they were poor, but they were impoverished. Impoverished in any form of input. And just to sit and talk to them for half an hour after you've done what you have to do. And so that unemployed father, age 45, who you've seen his daughter's got tuberculosis, whatever, that's probably the case, or abortion or skin disease, whatever. And you sit and talk to the man of 45 who has no hope at all. And this was very, very difficult to begin with. And I got rather sort of drawn into it because some of the people in the families that I got to know used to come along to the surgery and said they wanted to have a talk with the young doctor. Well, the young doctor was fairly busy doing something else by then, and they didn't want to actually talk at all, apart they had no complaints, but they just wanted to chat. And a certain amount of it was Catholic, and there was the priest was around, but the church didn't have very much impact, not in the same way as it did when I did my midder in the rotunda in Dublin. The priest was never out of the house. The priest was blessing the baby before I got there, and having his whiskey.
Yes. Then you went back to where? After you did your 2 years?
Then I went back I went into biochemistry. I got the Kirk Duncanson Research Fellowship of this college.
Right.
When I was awarded £600 a year.
Right.
For the first year, and 900 for the second year. And I held that for 2 years.
Had you got your membership by this stage? Or?
No, had I got my membership? No, I hadn't. I got membership in 1952. You weren't allowed to do it under 3 years.
Right.
But in 1951 maybe it was. No, I got to join the Kirk Duncanson Fellowship.
And what did you do then as your project in the Kirk Duncanson? Who did you work with?
Marion.
Oh, fantastic.
I went back to Marion. And George Boyd.
And George Boyd then appeared on the scene, did he?
Well, that's why I met George, because Marion had set up in somewhere a project. George was a junior lecturer. Marion was interested in the relationship of estrogenic hormones to arterial spasm, arterial flow. And I was interested in some of my earlier ideas about the lipid content of membranes, going back to starting my interest in cholesterol, but going back to some of the earlier things about the transport of ions across membranes and the lipid bilayer. And So I got myself deeply involved in what was known as the Central Medical Library in those days, and damn it, all the books that I wanted were missing. And there was somebody with a white coat with stacks of the books, and all the books that I was wanting. So this was George Boyd. and he kept complaining that the books he wanted were missing, and we were both looking at slightly different aspects of the same subject without knowing each other. We hadn't met.
Right.
And then, of course, we realized that we had the same interest. And I, in the meantime, had, with Gilchrist's support in a sort of a way, he was an advisor, and he got in touch with Marion and said, well, I want you to take this fellow Oliver in and train him, clean him up. And then I met George and we began to work together. And we worked for 10 years, I suppose. Well, no, yes, 10, 11 years together.
And the gist of what you did then was the effect of hormones on cholesterol turnover, is that?
Yes, well, some of the first things we did, the first paper George and I published, the first paper I ever published in 1953, was on the cholesterol phospholipid content of blood cholesterol during the course of the menstrual cycle.
Right.
Which has actually never been properly reproduced since. And this was, we took 12 women and we got them to record their oral temperature, and we measured their blood every single day right over through 5 weeks, showing a cyclical change, which is what Marion had expected we would show. So the maximum estrogenic activity, then you get a maximum reduction of cholesterol. And that spun off a whole series of subsequent papers and research about looking at different hormones, particularly estrogenic hormones. And I worked for many, many hours and days at the lab in the bench, which was good work and good discipline for me. I mean, we had, of course, crudest of techniques. We were looking at electrophoresis, which always had an 8-hour run. We only put the serum on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we were still up at 2 in the morning because there was no automatic switch to turn the thing off. So one of others had to be there. And it was very laborious, and cutting the paper and eluting the solvent out and measuring cholesterol with the old techniques. But it was good because if I hadn't got myself back and involved and actually hands-on in the lab for at least 3 years, because I went on and did an extension of the Kirk-Duncanson after that, I wouldn't have been able to, and working with George and Marion, I wouldn't be able to have encompassed anything like the actual basic biochemical knowledge of what was going on.
George had an encyclopedic knowledge of chemistry.
Huge.
What do you remember of George Boyd?
Oh, I was very fond of George, very fond of him. We had our times together when we didn't agree, but he was he was a steroid chemist, and as I suppose Marion was in a sense, rather than a lipid chemist, and he taught me a lot of steroid biochemistry. As a person, he was ambitious, he was ambitious, he was very much a Scot, and he found it very difficult to relax, and he was very really buttoned up in many ways. The best thing with George was when he'd had a drink or two, and like so many Scotsmen, they need that to bring them up to the surface. And he was aggressive.
But hugely kind, though, wasn't he?
Oh, marvellously. Oh, he's a wonderfully kind man.
Yes.
I was so fond of him. He was a dear man. The best thing about George was when you got him out of the lab, actually.
Yes.
He was a different person. You got him in the pub, and you could get him to ease off.
Yes.
He was very conscientious, and as you say, encyclopedic knowledge. And
yes.
we went our separate ways about 10 years later because we were both growing up by then. And he got an MRC grant, and I went back into was been working, but moved over a bit after 3 years with C.P. Stewart, and also kept moved a foot into the clinical side of things.
Now, in that 2 or 3 years that you were with Guy Marion and George Boyd, you were purely laboratory then, were you? Did you have
No,
any...
not entirely. No, I was 3/4 of the week.
Yes.
2/3, 3/4 of the week. And the rest of the time I had a clinical attachment with Gilchrist.
Right. And you persisted in that attachment with the Guild, didn't you?
Yes.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how we all stay with one mentor. I mean, I was with George, but then I was Ronnie Girdwood, and so...
Yes.
We have one man who dictates our path. And...
Well, that's necessary, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And then you went increasingly back into cardiology.
Then I went more and more into cardiology.
So there have been two themes.
But I never must be almost the only cardiologist in the country who's hardly ever passed a cardiac catheter, because that wasn't something that interested me.
Yeah.
And I wasn't interested in interested in clinical diagnosis, but I wasn't interested in really in rheumatic heart disease, which is what we all had in those days. Everything was rheumatic heart disease. We didn't have very much coronary disease. I was the application of, in a sense, the biochemical investigation, the clinical investigations we were making were separated.
Yes.
I was more concerned about early development of epidemiological studies as well. And I mean, for example, George and I were the first people to produce in 1955 200 consecutive patients, men and women, with 200 controls, age-matched, gender-matched as well, with the lipid pattern in the coronary population. This was the first paper in the UK defining that people who've got coronary heart disease have got raised cholesterol. So it was a bringing together, that was after the 3 years of biochemistry. I then continued working with George, providing him jointly, we were developing all sorts of clinical biochemical projects, which was very good. And I didn't, you see, ever become I was never a registrar. First time I was on the staff of the Royal Infirmary when I was a consultant physician. That was in 1964 or 63, something like that. And I was appointed physician to the medical outpatient department. And there was no such thing as a cardiologist. It didn't exist. Gilchrist was a physician, and I suppose Marquis must have been a physician too. They were the two in the cardiology department.
They were in 23 and 24, were they? So
25 and 26.
Sorry,
25
yes.
and 26. And I had the annoyance because I'd getting more and more involved in clinical medicine and in metabolic work, I suppose. Because that must have been before I went to the Rockefeller. Yes, it was 1963 it would be. And I was appointed as physician to the medical outpatient department without beds. Now that's the most frustrating thing. So I used to sit every single day seeing all this bunch of new outpatients. Now my experience in general practice was good for that, because there were all sorts of mixture of people. Yes. Very good for it. And I think I did a reasonably good job at it.
But some very fine physicians have done that job. Henry Matthew was...
Yes, right, Henry Matthew did that.
And sort of, it's a great cutter of teeth, that, isn't it?
But it was frustrating not to be able to follow your patient through.
Yes.
You made a diagnosis, and you weren't sure whether that was the right diagnosis, or went into somebody else's ward and somebody else's bed, and then you had to go and almost ask permission of the chief if you could see this patient. And that was unsatisfactory.
When did you first meet Bobby Marquis?
He immediately preceded me as Gilchrist's house physician. He had come out of the war and been a paratrooper and had a good war record and a highly organized man. And in 1947, he was Gilchrist's house physician in the first part of the year, and I in the second part of the year.
Right.
So he was 9 years or 10 years older than me. but because he came out of the war. And so, but everything was highly organized. He'd been in the army and as a, well, I don't know what age he is. I suppose he was 28 or 9 when he was the house physician. And so everything was systematized because he was used to that in the war, which is good for me.
He was a very great physician, wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
And
he remained very much committed to congenital heart disease. That was his great interest, and which was, I mean, I was exposed to this and therefore learnt a fair amount about it. But congenital heart disease and rheumatic heart disease is what we were dealing with in those days. Coronary heart disease was not, because, I mean, we developed the first intensive care unit, which interested me for a different set of reasons. But we did it for this reason, that in my wards, which in those days were Ward 31, when John Croom was there. Now, it so happened that we had the side wards there were going to have to be reconstructed. I don't remember why, whether they were damp or what the reason was, I don't know. And there were plans laid for this, and it was going to be a geriatric unit, 6 geriatric beds. And one waiting day, 6 men were admitted to the male ward, of course, with intense ischemic pain. And Sister Robinson put 3 of them together, and the other 3 scattered around the ward. And the 3 that were together died. And they were all under 50. And the other 3, I mean 6 came in with these, it was an incredible situation. So I remember saying to John Croom, we didn't have any monitors. I said, well, this is extraordinary cardiac death in somebody with just a recent infarct or ischemia and unstable angina. This is catching, which of course it was, but we didn't realize that. We had ventricular fibrillation, and seeing the man in the next door bed having ventricular fibrillation with ventricular fibrillation herself. and all we could realize was that you mustn't put these people together. So in the future we arranged not to. Then that was 1963. In 1962, Kervenhoven in Chicago had harnessed the AC current and then had harnessed DC current so that you could control the cycles. We were then able to, 1964, develop the defibrillator. And the first coronary care unit, as such, was established in Chapel Hill in Duke University, Georgetown in Washington, and in Duke, joint one. And the second was the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. And the Royal Infirmary coronary care unit was the geriatric unit that didn't take place, because I managed to somehow, I don't quite know how we got the influence going, but we did. Gilchrist, who was further down the corridor, was very concerned about this, and I still had my connections with him. Gilchrist and Croom and 1 or 2 others said, well, an intensive care unit. And then I remember having a big battle with the respiratory people, because they wanted to use this for severe asthma. And I said, no, this has got to be a dedicated coronary care unit. Nobody had ever heard of a coronary care unit at that time. And so that was established in 1964. And the reason why the units around the world, because there are many, are shaped in the way they're shaped, was because of the narrowness of the corridor in Ward 31.
So there was that horrid room opposite, wasn't there, where they were just the SHO slept.
Yeah, well, and you see, when I went as the WHO advisor to Israel twice, or 3 times altogether, and set up the coronary care unit in the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, and the Rambam Hospital in Tel Aviv, and the Rambam Hospital in Haifa, and the Tel Hashomer Hospital in Tel Aviv, all along the lines, the structural lines of the Royal Infirmary, because we knew it worked.
And then you went to the Rockefeller, did you?
I went to the Rockefeller for the longest. Unfortunately, I was only ever there for at a continuous span for 3 months, but I went back maybe 4 times in a year, working with Peter Ahrens.
Yes. Now, he was an extraordinary man, wasn't he?
Yes, yes.
Or is.
Who's still a very good friend of mine.
Yes.
And we made him an honorary graduate at the University of Edinburgh not very long ago.
Yes.
I went to the Rockefeller I still had an appointment. You see, I was a consultant in the Royal, and I couldn't just swan off. You didn't get leave to do that sort of thing. And the Board of Management, I think it was, allowed me to go for 10 weeks, and then back for a month, and then another month, and back for a month, then another month. Right. And that was the best I could do. I was there intermittently for about 9 months.
And these were doing these cholesterol studies?
Yes. Because then Peter Ahrens is a nutritionist, as you know, and biochemist, and Jules Hirsch and a variety of people with...
Was Alan Huffman there while you were there? Or?
Yes, but only slightly overlapped.
Yes.
DeWitt Goodman, that's a nice man down in Houston, Scott Grundy, right. And we were quite a bunch of people who a great occasion of sitting out I had a room, the 7th floor overlooking the East River, and we saw the ice floes coming down from the Hudson, and my God, it was cold, and this was the winter months, and it was a great experience, and I've never broken the connection with it. I was back there in May when they had a nutrition meeting, and it wasn't quite a formal postgraduate year because it was not easy to get the formal postgraduate year at that time. So that further consolidated my interest in biochemistry and lipids and nutrition. By then we'd started the first major clinical trial. We're using clofibrate in 1964. That went on for 10 years.
Tell us about your finding of clofibrate, and that's a nice story.
Well, yes. The reason that came in is a strange one, because there was an eccentric man who eventually blew himself up called Jeff Thorpe. And Jeff Thorpe was a biochemist in ICI. And he telephoned George in about 1954 and said, I've got something which will lower cholesterol. Do you think that's of any interest? So George was, I think, a bit stiff on the telephone, as he might be, but anyway, he came along. And it turned out this was a pesticide used by French farmers and prepared by ICI. And they're spraying their crops in the south of France. And the farmers got sick, and the farm workers got sick and were taken into hospital. And somebody along the line measured their cholesterol. And they found, why, I don't know. And they found the cholesterol absolutely rock bottom. So the old unit system, 80 milligrams per 100 ml, right down. And of course they were also vomiting, because this stuff was bloody toxic.
Yes.
However, Jeff Thorpe came to the conclusion that this had a specific effect. And he set up and was sponsored by ICI, to have a sizable metabolic laboratory. And bit by bit, we began to test derivatives of this phenylethyl acetic acid, as it was, and we tested different derivatives until we got away from the toxic and the hepatic effects, which there were hepatic effects,
yes.
And produced this stuff called atramid, and then said that this was and got it wrong, said this was an orally active androsterone. This is because of my hormonal interests. There's nothing of the kind, actually. It's got nothing to do with the adrenal glands. So it got all that wrong, and it was renamed Atramid S or clofibrate, and then we got the big trial going, and that was interesting because it was the first study in the world that actually showed that lowering cholesterol did also reduce coronary heart disease. It had adverse effects, and so that it wasn't marketable. Well, it was marketable, it's still marketed, but it wasn't widely used.
No. When did you start becoming interested in the college?
Well, you see, Gilchrist was very influential and insisted that Bobby Marcus and I would come to the college debates and quarterly meetings in about 1958, 1960, something like that. Well, I didn't know what the college was. I had no idea. I got my membership, but that's all. It was just an examination body as far as I was concerned. Yes. And I think I was a fellow probably by then, but even so, it didn't really have much impact. And then I sat through these quarterly meetings.
What was the topic then? Was it anything that has lasting interest?
No, well now thereby hangs, you see, I got very depressed by the college because it seemed to be a strange, antediluvian, somewhat incestuous body which was talking about, not talking about anything to do really with clinical medicine, and certainly not talking about any form of clinical research that I could identify. It was a body that I recognized as very important in terms of setting standards and conducting the examination. It didn't have very much impact in my world, and nevertheless I felt I'd better do what the boss says. And so I came to these meetings, and then I got more involved, and every now and then, with great trepidation and great anxiety and much sweating of the palms of my hand, I would join in the discussions. And with the young boy to stand up in the college in those days was fairly formidable. And so I then got more involved in some of the training aspects. And I had had rather a mixed training, as you hear, and hadn't sort of gone through the orthodox line of what would now be called a registrar. And I was concerned about somewhere widening the horizons of opportunity of young people to move backwards and forwards into what we now call clinical science, from clinical medicine into basic, or not how basic it is, but into scientific subjects related to medicine, which I've been doing all my life. And so I began getting more and more involved in that, and any theme, any debate or quarterly meeting when that could be taken up, I wanted to get the field of clinical science identified as such. There was no membership in clinical science or anything like that. It seemed to be that the old physician, who still in a sense metaphorically had his top hat and swallow coat on, and even some of them actually did, were obviously very important figures, and they were my teachers or my previous generation teachers, but they weren't in any way thinking about themes of which were didn't seem to take measurement important. Everything was done on a basis of laying on your hands and concluding, the art of medicine rather than the science of medicine. And I mean, there were so many things you could measure, and there was plenty of laboratory tests you could measure. And I've always taken the view that if you could measure something, measure it. And, yes. But this was not a popular approach. And so then I got involved through the college, I suppose, into the training of clinical scientists, which is something that I've felt very strongly about for many years and written a lot about, and trying to get a proper career structure for clinical scientists, which I might say I've done through the London College to a large extent. And they have now produced, about a year and a half ago, guidelines as to how to enter clinical science, which acknowledge my activity. So that's I got angered by the tradition of the college. I got angered by it seemed to me the backward-looking approach, the fact that it was to me too much of an old boys' club, and I was prepared to leave it like that and get on with what interested me. But then various people Bobby Marcus was quite influential, but a lot of other people as well, said, well, I mean, trying to encapsulate it over a period of 10 or 15 years, well, if you do feel as strongly as this, why don't you do something? Why don't you join the college?
You were on the Croom Committee, weren't you?
Yes, the Croom Committee.
We were in the same quartet.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. Now remember that, that's very important, the Croom Committee. We didn't, I don't think, quite know what we were doing, but that was the first, I think, examination of the naval that I can remember, when the college was really looking at its, evaluating what it was doing, what it was standing for. Now we had a series of presidents, not that I think the presidents particularly were all that influential, but there were people who were not very, very interested in, Stanley Davison was, but that was a way back, not all that interested in the scientific approach to medicine. And John Croom set up that committee. I don't think he actually was very interested himself, but he recognized the need for it. And there were certain, as you know, precise recommendations for the future. I must read the Croom Committee report again, because I'm not sure how much of that's actually ever been enacted.
Yes, I've never looked at it again.
But it'd be interesting.
It would be very interesting, wouldn't it? I thought that I loved John Croom. I thought that he was a great man who had a vision but most people say that he wasn't a visionary. But in fact, he was. Behind that buffer approach,
yes.
And someone who could marry an actress in those days and who was a man of vision, if you like.
He was a very good friend of mine, because I was his junior physician for a long time, and we had many long discussions in the evening and so on. And he was a wise man who didn't aspire in any sense to have any scientific knowledge about medicine. Actually, not at all. But he recognized the need to encourage it.
Yes.
And you boys, you carry on. Your generation, and you have all my support. He was very supportive to my activities. And then partly, I suppose, because of the Croom Committee, partly because I got more involved, and partly because a lot of friends began to push me. Said, well, if you do feel that this is a somewhat fusty place, do something about it.
Right.
So that's how it came about.
So that's how, your first, if you like, big involvement was when you came on the council, wasn't it?
That's right. I came on the council about not very long before, maybe 3 years before being elected. Quite a short time. And I blew cold and hot, quite often quite severely cold, because I didn't see that this was a body that was going to activate anything. And around that time, there was, just after I suppose I came in the council, the first move to have the conference centre was discussed. I'm bound to say that I wasn't very enthusiastic, as I wasn't sure how anybody was going to come to the conference centre. Proved to be completely wrong, because it was a great success. I didn't vote against it or anything like that, but I just wondered whether this was the right way for the college to go, because I felt that the university had, I was very much a university man,
yes,
and not a college man. And I suppose I've always remained a university man. And I felt the university had all the opportunities and the lecture theatres and so on. But of course, there's a sort of metamorphosis, and I realized that this was something which was worth getting a teeth into.
Yes. Who was your predecessor as president?
Immediately it was Ronnie Girdwood.
Right.
And before that was Ronnie Robertson.
Right. So, and your successor was?
John Richmond.
John Richmond. So the conference centre was fully established by the time that you were president?
Yes and no. I mean, I had to it was opened in May of 87, I suppose, and when I became president, it was not completed. It was not structurally finished. It was about 2/3 the way through, and almost the first thing I had to do was to deal within a week of being president of an invitation to some prominent person to open this.
Yeah.
And the Prince of Wales was approached by my predecessor, and within a week of being president, we got a letter to say the Prince of Wales declined the honour. And so then there was we didn't know when it was going to be finished anyway, and so there was a certain amount of discussion in council. Well, what do we do now? This has got to be somebody said the Lord Provost. I soon dealt with that one. I think he'd be the right person. I forget who he was anyway. And so then Princess Anne's name was. I said, well, why Princess Anne? Why not go to the top and get the Queen Mum? And so, well, no, that wasn't going to be practical. And I said, well, there's no harm in trying, is it? And so that was. I had a sort of roundabout way of getting at this, and so we got the invitation through, and she was delighted, as you know, and appeared about 7 or 8 months later with all sorts of very precise questions, taking her around that day when we showed an exhibition. Miss Ferguson got the exhibition up of all sorts of things, and why do you need rhubarb? Well, of course, I hadn't thought about why you needed rhubarb. And they all Napoleon's soldiers weren't constipated, were they? Well, it's a rather tricky question with the Queen Mum. I said, well, no, I suppose not, ma'am. And I said, well, and you haven't got a very good answer, have you, to my question? I think you had to do your homework and find out why they needed rhubarb in those days. And so we moved on to the next one. And this is opium, because the college had been very interested in opium, because Edinburgh, Duncan Flockett, had, let's say, the export from China, the rights of morphine and so on. And so the college, I get my history wrong, but I suspect the college had its interest in opium in the 1820s, something like that, because Miss Ferguson had a picture which related to Waterloo. And so the Queen Mother was asking, well, what was the anaesthetic? And we related to the fact that Lord Sandwich, I think it was, who lost his leg with a bullet, with a cannon. And what happened to him? Who looked after him? And so, of course, I had no idea, naturally. And I was losing marks. This was a membership exam, which I was making no progress in. And what did they use? I said, well, I suppose they use alcohol, ma'am, you see. Well, of course, so do I now, you see. And whenever I have a pain, I use alcohol. I don't need an anaesthetic. And the only way of taking a leg off would be to give them alcohol. Well, you didn't need this opium, did you? Why do you do that? They're supposed to make money. Was that it, you see? Right. So we had this series of ripostes, and then there was a disaster because the Sir James Mackenzie's fountain pen, which he had to sign the roll, of course, had no ink in it. Yes. And well, that was not a very clever thing. Everything laid on, flowers in all directions, and picked it up to put Elizabeth and drives. So that was fun.
What were the other events of your presidency?
Well, that was the big event. There was one which appealed to me, which is perhaps wouldn't appeal to everybody. The first commission which was established in the House of Lords and to look into the future of science and medicine was held here on a number of occasions. A man called Lord Nelson, who was chairman of the Steel Board, now dead, I think, came with 5 or 6 peers here, and because Bill Hoffenberg, my opposite number in the London College, was not that interested in scientific aspects of medicine, even although he was a very well-known gastroenterologist in his time in Birmingham. And Arthur Kennedy, there was a changeover in Glasgow, as usual, from a surgeon to a physician. Arthur Kennedy came a little bit later, a renal man, and he wasn't all that interested. And I was very concerned that, all because of the background of interest in clinical science, that there should be a greater opportunity and, if possible, more money, a career structure in clinical science. And this Lords Committee seemed to be a way into it. And we had a lot of very good discussions, and they used to come for a whole day, maybe once a month, or for something like 6 months, or thereby. And then the first report, there have been two, the first report of the report of the first commission, established that, independent of the Medical Research Council, there ought to be some form of career structure. It was rather ill-defined. It'll be in the library. Then the second commission, which then succeeded that, wasn't a royal commission, it was a Lord's committee, then went even further and appointed, or made the recommendation to appoint a research division within the Department of Health, and that's what Michael Peckham had. And he was the first director of this. And all of that came from these discussions. And I'm not sure how much this college had an input, but I personally was extremely pleased to think that we were being so involved, and I enjoyed it and felt it was gradually getting the political scenario moving, because as you know very well, in medicine we have no proper lobbies in either the House of Lords or the House of Commons, and we have no influence at all. And to be able to provide something other than the college-type training, the college-type accreditation, because the universities in general weren't interested in medicine. I mean, they had a department of medicine, sure, but they weren't interested really in medicine unless it pertained to the university. And colleges were not interested in medicine unless it pertained to the actual practice of medicine as relates to the college. Sure. And something was needed between this. Yes. And I think gradually, still not completely achieved, but it's going ahead. And with the changes in thinking and knowledge in science, so the whole DNA had arrived by then, and of course gradually we're getting into the beginnings of molecular biology, and that's all taking off now in a big way. And there are, as I said earlier, the London College, no doubt supported by this college, has now got a clear-cut guidelines of how to enter the discipline of clinical science, which must be good, I think.
You were drawn into the college because you saw it as being engulfed in cobwebs and the past.
Mm.
How did you tackle your time of removing the cobwebs? How did you set about it?
Well, I felt very aggressive in the first year or so, and I deliberately, obviously, the day after I was elected, I had it in my hip pocket, as it were. If I hadn't been elected, it wouldn't have happened, but having been elected, I then sent a statement to the Scotsman about the 6 principles which I was proposing to follow, right, which caused a lot of irritation with the old fellows.
Do you remember those 6 principles?
No, I'd have to get it out. I have to get it out. It's too far back now. But yes. I know it caused a lot of irritation. And
what was the drift of them?
What?
What was the drift of the 6 principles?
The drift was let us move into modern medicine, right, and let us get away from the idea of an old boys' club.
Right.
That was the drift.
Yes.
Let us take things into the 20th century, and amongst which was, you see, my election was the first contested election in 49 years.
Right.
And the vice president would automatically move on.
Yes. Now,
I don't think that's good, and I'm apprehensive it might even happen again. And I don't think that's the way it should go. I think there should be open election. And yes, in the London College, as you know, there are 5 or 6 candidates up, and they have a different voting system. And I think that I still consider that there is a danger. I don't know the new generation well enough, and I may be falsely criticizing, but I think there is a danger of being too comfortable in the college practice and principles. And I think that somebody needs to come in every now and then and flex muscles.
Yes. So how did you how did you approach the revolution then? Having set up your principles.
I set out the principles, and then I brought council down to 6 people.
Right.
From 22 or something.
Goodness.
And and council was diffused in all sorts of ways, and subcommittees and so on. Subcommittees of law, subcommittees, postgraduate subcommittees, and all sorts of... This didn't seem to be... I mean, some of the committees were 18 strong. There was something, a public health committee, I can't forget the exact names now, and they had very worthy people as chairman of these, and who, generally speaking, were not council members. So you had a committee meeting every month, maybe, seriously studying a problem, producing a report back to council, whereas there was nothing more than a written report, and that came in once a year. That doesn't make any sense at all. And I thought council should be taking the decisions and not all these committees. And so I didn't make myself very popular, because I got rid of a number of the committees, or put them on ice, and decided that the only way that we were going to make progress was to have a strong central body. And that was one thing. Second, I was completely in opposition to Ronnie Girdwood, my predecessor, regarding the London College, because he had been opposed to the London College on principle. We are a Scottish college, and maybe that's because I was an Englishman. But I didn't agree with that at all. I thought that we needed to think as a group. We couldn't afford in Britain, with the advances that were going on in the world, just to be an isolated college in Edinburgh. And Arthur Kennedy in Glasgow was very much of the same view, and Bill Hoffenberg was of the same view as well. Bill was a little bit edgy in case the Scottish colleges were taking over some of the privileges of the London College. But we all got on very well. There was Bill Hoffenberg, Arthur Kennedy, a man called Ivo Drury, who died in office, who was the president of the Dublin College. And the 4 of us became good friends. And we were working very much for a joint program, joint activity. And also the College of Surgeons in London became very much involved. And it was during my time that the Conference of Colleges was established. And Bill Hoffenberg, I think, was the first chairman, probably the first chairman, or the second, if not the first. And the Conference of Colleges, which was, you might think of it as almost a sort of Academy of Medicine. And that was very much my idea, that we should try to act as a an agreed group, not a disparate set of individual colleges. And that, of course, didn't produce a great deal of support in some quarters here, as you can imagine, because I was being regarded as being disloyal to the principles of the old college. And during the 3 years, I really had quite a lot of disagreements, but I was determined, and I think from the way some of the subsequent people, Tony Toft and John Cash even, have commented, I think that perhaps I should have gone further than I did, but it certainly changed the attitude, and I had the strength of being, as I said, an elected president and not an automatic president.
Yes.
And that gave me the opportunity to put forward the policies I wanted to put forward, and with a small council which was very supportive, very supportive.
Who was the secretary during this period?
Chalmers.
Right.
Tom Chalmers.
Yes.
Rheumatologist.
Yes. Yes.
Who was excellent, and followed us proposed by John Anderton, who was secretary.
Right.
And during my time it changed over.
And what about the introduction of the conference centre? Did that form part of this plan?
Well, well, you see, there it was. It was not quite completed, and Queen Mum came and opened it, and then we had a lot of uncertainty about how it was to be used and how we were going to get money. And that delightful naval man, what was it the name, who sadly has died, who was we called him the bursar of the college for a while. Do you remember that?
Eliot. No, he was Eliot, but he was
Eliot.
Arnold.
Eliot,
Yes.
that's right.
Yes.
Who became ill, and he was a very good man. Of course, he was an ex-service, and he was a good organizer. And we developed a lot of ideas. It was underused for the first year and a half. A certain amount of touch and go, and a certain amount of resistance from within the college for opening it up. I mean, having got it, the sensible thing to do was to use it. And,
Yes.
and if you have Sotheby's having the antique sale, fine and well,
Yes.
and brings in money.
Yes.
And of course now it's used marvellously. It's been a huge success and a money spinner.
Yes.
I know that some people say they haven't got too much money here. They have a great deal more money now than they did when I was president. And I had a treasurer whose name we won't mention, who was actually quite a good friend, who had a fist as tight as this. There was, of course, all sorts of other extremely interesting things which come to all the presidents, and that's the international travel. And I got very concerned and bothered with the Thatcher, and had a go at her on one occasion about the British Council, because I went to Kuala Lumpur, and I think 3 times probably. And the first time, having never been there, not realizing what an advanced place it is, and the fellows of the Edinburgh College will give the president a dinner and this, and the message was, why are you turning your back on us? My uncle, my grandfather, my father, my this and that were all trained in Britain, trained in medicine. Not necessarily Edinburgh, but many of them were. Why are you turning your back on us? We're not going to establish a medical school here in Kuala Lumpur, and we can't afford to spend £9,000 a year for 3 years, or whatever the figure would be, being trained in Britain. We can't do that, and you are not encouraging this. And we used to be a protectorate in Malaysia, and this message came through from Hong Kong, and came through from Bombay, and it was all the same, as Ceylon, the same thing. And so I got hold of the chairman of the British Council, whose name was a great big fat man, John Charles, I think his name was. And then we, certain amount of support from Bill Hoffenberg, and quite a lot of support. I was on the MRC just before that, so I got quite a lot of support from actually Colin Dollery, was probably the person who helped me a great deal. Till we saw Thatcher. And of course, in no way would we get any money from her. And what was much worse was that she didn't seem to understand the responsibility, or wasn't prepared to hear the responsibility of teaching or give the opportunity for learning for people outside Britain. She was so insular,
Yes.
and it was a very difficult interview. And it wasn't quite as bad as some I've heard about, but it wasn't very successful. And the fact of the matter was that we didn't get any more money for the British Council. But I wrote 1 or 2 letters. I wrote a letter to the Times which had a lot of correspondence about it, which was fully supported. I don't think many people would. I mean, it's like the World Service today. There's cutting back on the World Service.
Yes.
We can't afford to do that in Britain. And to say that we can't afford to do it is
Wrong.
Quite wrong in my
Yes.
view.
Yes.
So the visits to the Far East were extremely interesting, and we had the centenary of the Australasian College of Medicine And that was fun because the London College and this college went out, and we had various parties and lectures and seminars and so on. I enjoyed representing the college abroad and felt fairly humble about it, fairly concerned that we weren't doing our bit. You see, I went to Pakistan, and there's a little minor anecdote here, because on arrival in Islamabad, the vice president of the Pakistani college met me and my wife and said, well, we haven't got any plans for you really, except for tomorrow. And 4 o'clock we have an arrangement for you to see the president, who has been rather busy. And so, certainly. What I hadn't realised was it wasn't the president of the college, it was President Zia, you see, Zia al-Huk. So I went to the presidential palace, and Zia was a man of about 5'2", with black hair and staring black eyes. It's parted in the centre. 2 enormous Pathan soldiers on either side, both of whom were 6'5", and it's just sort of diminutive man opening the doors, and so was shaking hands. And it was on the 6 o'clock television news or something, and we got over the public side of it, and he said, well, exactly what do you want? To me. And I said, well, President, it isn't really what I want, it's what you want, or what I think you want, you see. And he said, well, tell me. And I said, well, I understand from correspondence with your college that you would like 25 postgraduate fellowships for a period of 1 or 2 years, which we can set up in Edinburgh. And we would be very happy to do this, and we will make arrangements to do it. I wasn't quite sure how we were going to do it, but still, I thought because I wasn't sure where we were going to put them. But anyway, I said we were going to do it, and work that one out later. And so he said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, I understand the problem is money. And we will look after them here. We'll teach them for a year or 2 years, but it's travel money and some subsistence. Well, I haven't been told that, you see. I said, well, that's the problem. So he snapped it. He was a total dictator. And snapped envelopes, and Equerry went off and got the Minister of Health, who had dragged in the Minister. What's the problem here? Professor Oliver says that we don't have any money to train these men. You know perfectly well we've got to train these people. If we don't train them in a high level of medicine, what are the medical services going to be like in Pakistan? And he blew his top to this man, you see. And so the poor minister said, well, President, the fact of the matter is we don't have any money for this. We might manage 8, I've calculated. 8. Take it from my budget. And so they would reel back and take it from my budget. I don't quite know where the budget was. I'll do it for you. Just take it from me. This will be fixed. So that was that. I went away very pleased, and so he said, oh, by the way, before you go, is Madam here? You see, my wife. Yes, Madam is here, but Madam wasn't allowed to come to the audience. And so I said, well, what are you going to do tomorrow? And I said, well, we were hoping to go up towards the Karakoram highway, up to Gilgit, and have it in 2-3 days off up in the north, in the mountains. And he said, I'll arrange it all. So, and I'll finish the story in a minute, but because it's interesting this way, because the next morning at 10 o'clock, there was a Brigadier RAMC and his wife, and a pilot, and President Zia's plane, and ourselves, and we were taken up to Gilgit, and had a tremendous time, and unique time going up to the Chinese border. But about 10 days later, when by that stage I'd got myself to Singapore, and on arrival in Singapore, just before we were going to give Lee Kuan Yew an honorary degree, when I had to make some address to Lee Kuan Yew that evening, news came through that President Zia had been assassinated. So I had by then got the arrangement 9 days earlier for the money to be paid, you see, because it never was paid, because he was assassinated. Okay, and yes. What happened was that this very same plane, exactly the same number, was blown up. And so it was one of the rather disconcerting parts of
I was going to say that, how did that affect, as meeting him in this way, how did it affect your style as president? But then the sting is in the tail, isn't it?
Yes, the sting of it. Well, and when I had to come back here, you see, to speak to the postgraduate committee and postgraduate board, I wasn't at all pleased with this. So I had total failure, and I thought I was going to bring back a success story.
Yes.
But Lee Kuan Yew was a formidable man. But these were interesting events, and I think that the opportunity for the presidents of the college and other officers of the college to travel and represent British medicine, and particularly Edinburgh medicine, is very, very important. Unfortunately, but things change, and there's a Hong Kong Academy of Medicine now, where there wasn't in my time, and no doubt that each of these areas in the Far East will develop their own infrastructure. Well, that's how it should go, of course,
yes.
But there's no reason why we shouldn't continue to interrelate. And
it must have been quite curious. I mean, you travelled a lot as a scientist. It must have been interesting, instead of travelling as a scientist, to travel as the president.
Yes.
It must have been quite a...
Completely different.
Yes.
Because you see, you had to wear two hats, particularly in Australia, and sometimes into Singapore, because I kept every now and then meeting amongst the fellows or the members of the Edinburgh College somebody who I knew very well as a distinguished cardiac scientist.
Yes.
And you had to wear two hats. And I tell you a thing, I think the thing that I found most disconcerting as a president, I don't know whether other presidents have said the same thing, and that is having to make this more or less the same after-dinner speech to the same people weekly. Well, I mean, they weren't the same people, there were some changes, but one had you had to produce something original.
Yes.
And the first time, I'm not a natural after-dinner speaker, but the first time I really had to get going on this, I spent the whole of the weekend before really sweating blood on the damn thing. And it was a disaster. It was a ladies' dinner. It was a total disaster. And so I then realized, and I don't know whether others have probably it's all written down, how to make after-dinner speech or how not to, but the less time you spend within reason, the more successful it is. And towards the end of my office, what I used to do was to buy the Times, the Scotsman, and the preceding evening paper, and I used to spend about 20 minutes or 30 minutes in my room picking out things from there, particularly the evening paper. If you could send somebody up in the room, James Innes or somebody like that, you would poke fun at somebody.
Yes.
Early on, and they all laugh, you see. And once you've got a laugh going, then
Yes.
you can freewheel. And I spent a hell of a lot of time in the first year or two with these speeches. Also, I think it is repetitive. You go to travelling abroad is interesting enough, but you're meeting different people. But there was a certain arrangements. You go to Dundee every year. You go to Inverness every second year. You go to Sunderland every second year or every year. The college has got certain prescribed activities. That's good for the first year or two, but I'd found that the formal activities in the third year were repetitious. I lost my spark in the third year. I know I did.
Do you think that is because you had already affected that change which you were going to make, or is it that the college had got you and had affected you? Who came out changed?
A bit of both. A bit of both. I think towards the end the college had got me.
Yes.
Well, I was asked by four or five people to stay on for another year. Well, I was still, I don't remember what it was, I must have been 63, I suppose, something like that, 62. So, and I was still fairly active. And I had the cardiovascular research unit. We had a university department to run, which was quite difficult and fairly time-consuming. And I decided that I would prefer, so you can interpret this as you like, I prefer to get back to the cardiovascular associate. It's actually a difficult job to do this, that being president and being in active service.
Very, very difficult.
I used to say, and I think it's still the case, the only way that I could manage to do it was to have sounds silly thing to say, to have a car parking space in the university and a car parking space at the back here, so that I know I could go back and forwards, maybe twice a day, and I didn't need to bother about it. And it, of course, you had to cross Prince Street, but even so, that was something which was you could work out. I used to come in here early. That was another way of doing it. And of course, another thing that I found very, very repetitive, and I hadn't fully realized this when I came into office, that for all the main committees in the UK, in England and Wales, I should say, in England and Wales, there's the same one you have to attend in England, and which has neither of which liaise particularly well with each other. And the same subjects have been discussed, and the same government policy has been discussed. And you know perfectly well that none of these committees are going to alter government policy.
Yes. How did you get on with St Andrew's House?
With?
St Andrew's House, did you?
Not well. Well, you only need to, I mean, maybe one shouldn't mention names, but I will, because the Minister of Health was Michael Forsyth.
Right.
Who was totally intransigent. He was, and still is, a committed conservative politician who wasn't prepared to look sideways at all. We had various representatives. I got on very well with the medical department, but the politicians, no. And it was not a very happy time.
Did this confirm your... The beauty of science is that you can make your own way, in a way, that you can...
Yes.
And you can explore your own thoughts, though in these big trials, there's not... What's they say?
Every now and then, exploring your own thoughts and making your own way. You see, I think, and I began to realize this, maybe fairly early on, that to make a certain number of ex cathedra statements to the media stirs them up, because they don't like that, and they begin to listen. But they won't. You can represent whatever you want in St Andrew's House across a table. They're not going to listen to that. Yeah. There's a letter in the Scotsman, or there's something in Evening News. They get fussed, and you begin to get some form of response.
Yes. But did you find the structure of the college and the structure of the sort of system very frustrating, or did you feel, as you sound to have done, that you in your turn set up a new system which your successors were able to take advantage of?
No, the latter, because during the last year the council, of course, is changing all the time a little bit. It was apparent that we needed to expand it in certain ways. I mean, during my term of office, for example, the paediatricians had by right a council member, as they didn't have before. The Faculty of Public Health by right. So the council increased its size again to maybe 9 or 10. And then, as these people came in, then the activities of the council became greater. You see, before I was president, when I was on the council before, the meetings would go on from maybe 6 until 8:30, a break for half an hour for supper, and then 9 until midnight. Well, nobody can do that. I mean, that is. I mean, I stopped every council meeting after 2.5 hours, and if we hadn't finished our business, then we'd put it on to the next one. But in fact, we did finish our business, and you get exhausted if you're going from 6 till midnight. Yes. You don't take sensible decisions at all. No. So that was another sort of very simple way of dealing with things, and I hurried business through. I have no doubt I was being accused of being autocratic. probably was. But we got on with things, and there was never, and I probably didn't give enough time for discussion or subcommittee opinions, but there was always a chance, always an opportunity given for debate or questions. And generally speaking, I must say that I've had a lot of support. The councils that I had, I think, were absolutely excellent. They didn't always agree with me, and would say so. We discuss it and adjust.
Yes.
But it wasn't a long, drawn-out debate that went on forever without a conclusion. I didn't have time.
No.
I didn't have time not to reach a conclusion.
No. Were there other things that you remember that were important decision makings? I mean, you restructured the system and made it contemporary.
Tried to. At the time, I mean, was there any? Well, it was to some extent a series of battles. I was quite relieved when some of the old guard began to withdraw.
Yes.
Well, nice people.
Yes.
And we didn't. I didn't think I had any made any actual personal enemies. But you had to be. Having set your sights, stay with them, and people didn't like them. And there were one or two quite major clashes I had, and I didn't succeed in the way that the college structure has been modernized. I wanted to do a lot there, but the House Conveners Committee was very much stuck in a mould. And the House Convener in those days was not a member of council. And I had the great problems of trying to get that office either abolished or brought on board, because I mean, this is the actual buildings are a responsibility. See, what is now the president's room, which was the I'm trying to think the name of the Baron Ord.
Yes.
Or Ord. Well, anti-smoking and health had that as a committee room, and there were a whole series of committees up in that side of the college. And it was only after maybe 5 months that I realised that we owned all this. This was our property, and so I said to the treasurer, "Well, look, anti-smoking and health, what the hell are they doing in here? This is well, you can't go in there." I said, "Well, what do you mean I can't go in there?" So I said, "It's a college property," and I went in and saw this beautiful oval room, which was pretty tatty in certain places, but its structure, it was lovely. And this was a college room, and so I said to the lady who's Sir Russell Hillhouse's wife. I can't remember what now, who's a permanent secretary's wife. Well, she wasn't. He wasn't that in those days. But I would feel this must be taken over. Of course, of horror. And John Crofton wasn't very pleased with me, I might say, either, because John was very much involved in anti-smoking and health. But I said, well, if we're going to bring this college into something in the 20th century, it's got wonderful facilities, and it's fairly badly utilised. I mean, there are secretarial offices on one side, and there's these committees here, and what are they doing? They only meet every now and then. Oh, well, we must have the money. I said, I don't believe you need the money at all. And so we went into the accounts, and I had quite big arguments about this. Anyway, I got them out, and got several of them out, which of course made a huge difference.
Yes.
And I mean, the whole development of number 8 has been a consequence of kicking these people out.
Yes.
It's taken quite a while to get it going, but now it's very attractive, and it establishes the presence of the college in the city of Edinburgh.
Yes.
And also establishes the college along with the other colleges. Whether there should be an Academy of Medicine, that's another issue. I mean, we got involved to some extent, and I know that Tony Toft and others have got involved more since, but it would make sense, would it not, if there was a single Scottish Academy of Medicine, and that includes surgery and obstetrics. It doesn't. There's no doubt at all the voice of Scotland in the UK is diluted by the fact there are 3 colleges. Mm-hmm. And going to the Conference of Colleges in London, I was not really Bill Hartenberg or Margaret Turner Warwick's opposite number, because there were 3 of us were.
Yes, yes.
There was no, so we had surgeons here and physicians and surgeons in Glasgow, so there were always 3 people. Mm-hmm. And much as we got on with each other, which we did, it was a diluted voice, and there should be an organised and integrated Scottish voice. And if some form of devolution is to take place, then that would be an even bigger argument for having a Scottish Academy of Medicine.
Yes.
Oh, sure, there are problems. Where would it be? Physically, where would it be? And none of the 3 colleges are going to give up their beautiful premises. Yeah. And who would be the first president and so on? I made a suggestion the other day, quite recently, that I thought that if the office is a problem, which apparently some people say it is, you get something like the Speaker of the House of Commons. I mean, that's a very good structure.
Yes.
And the fact that she happened to be a Labour Member of Parliament is beside the point, because she's not regarded as a party person at all. She's a very powerful, independent person. And you get somebody of that stature.
What did Ray Gilchrist think about the changes that you were making? Did you talk to him during this period?
He was getting fairly old.
Right.
He didn't... I used to go and see him once every 6 months, right up to the time he died. He was 96 when he died last year, so a year older than a year. So that in 1987, he would have been 88.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And he listened, and we had a glass of sherry in his house and so on. He used to tend to say, oh, it's all so far long ago. And he didn't relate very much. I mean, he wasn't unsupportive, but he wasn't really involved.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes. I think we've
covered a lot.
We've covered a huge amount, haven't we? We've even, oh dear.
No, my wife's sitting out there, don't worry. She's done that before.
Yes. Oh, that was fantastic.
You've got what you want, have you?
Yes, thank you. Yes.